Okay, now we're going to talk about another part of the history of the Cold War, particularly the early Cold War, and that is the Red Scare. Now, we already had a Red Scare back in World War One times, right after World War One, early 1920s. Now we're going to have another Red Scare, although this one lasts a bit longer. But there are several things that lead to anti-communist feelings, particularly what your book would call almost panic. And one of the things is Russia exploding their atomic bomb successfully, the loss of China to the communists. There were some communist activities going on in America, and the Soviet governments that are communist that are spreading around the world. Several of these all form together to culminate in the Red Scare. People are paranoid that this has to have some tie back in America. Oh my goodness, all these other governments are falling, and it's all part of some communist plot to overthrow America. Well, like I said earlier, there's a saying that you're not paranoid if they're really out to get you. And that's the concept here of, well, yes, there were some communist activities going on in America, but was it really as bad as people were making it out to be? Well, that's a different story. But let's talk about two things. Your book has a subheading of HUAC, H-U-A-C, which we'll get to in a minute, and Alger Hiss. HUAC is the House, like House of Representatives. It's the House Un-American Activities Committee. And their job, their job is basically to root out un-American activities, and they're trying to lay the blame. This is a Republican-based movement, and they're trying to lay the blame on the Democrats and basically say, look at what the Democrats let go on. They let all these communist activities go unchallenged and unreported, and they knew about it. In fact, there were some Democrats that were involved in this. And you're going to see with McCarthyism, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, there are actual allegations leveled against high-ranking government officials, but little proof to back it up. So with the HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, they investigated, as I said when we Skyped, they investigated several Hollywood actors and actresses. They barred several Hollywood writers from actually writing. This is where you hear about getting blacklisted. This goes on in America, where basically the HUAC, it's going to say, okay, you have communist leanings, and you're writing some things that seem communistic, so we're not letting you write any more screenplays. You're done. There were 10 infamous or famous, depending upon how you look at it, Hollywood actors and actresses that when questioned by HUAC, they just refused to answer. And this causes problems for them because a lot of Americans thought, well, if you're not answering their questions, then are you guilty? And so their popularity starts to fall during this time, and they end up backtracking a little bit. But the House Un-American Activities Committee causes problems for a lot of people. However, they thought that they were rooting out communist activities. At least they thought. That was the goal, to point out, these are communist activities, and look, it's tied to the Democrats. One of the more successful things that the HUAC or HUAC did was they discovered an actual communist plot in America, and that involved Alger Hiss. Now, Alger Hiss was a senior ranking member of the State Department. He was a high-level official at the State Department in the federal government. And someone came out, and not just anyone, by the way, this just wasn't some random person. This was a former Communist Party of America member. And he comes out and he charges Alger Hiss with, he claims Alger Hiss passed on sensitive information to him, knowing that he would pass it on to the Communist Party. And this was Whittaker Chambers, that was the man's name. And Whittaker Chambers makes this claim, and Alger Hiss sued him for slander. However, it's not slander if you have the proof. So Whittaker Chambers produces documentation showing that Alger Hiss was involved. However, there's a catch. there's this thing called the statute of limitations. And depending upon the crime, after a certain number of years passes, you can no longer be prosecuted for it. It doesn't work with every crime. Like murder, for example, there is no statute of limitations on that. But anyway, Alger Hiss is investigated, but the statute of limitations has run out, so he can't be charged with treason or anything of that nature, like sedition. So they did find, though, Richard Nixon is involved with HUAC, with HUAC, and he presses and presses and presses and finally finds out that in the course of the investigation, Alger Hiss has committed perjury. And so Alger Hiss is then sentenced to 7 years in prison for perjury. But this makes people nervous because here you do have actual definitive proof that a high-ranking official in the State Department was part of some communist plot. Okay, now let's look on to two more things. One is the federal government, their loyalty program, and the Rosenberg case. So let's start with the federal loyalty program. And in this, we have the problem with Alger Hiss. And the federal government basically wants to ensure that their employees are loyal to America and not to Russia or China or someone else. It's a big deal when state secrets and sensitive information are leaked out. So in 1947, the Truman administration authorized investigations into federal employees to basically review them and see how loyal they are. And in 1950, the president authorized sensitive agencies, so like CIA, for example, that deals with sensitive information, Atomic Energy Commission, to fire people that weren't loyal or that were determined to be some kind of liability. So we have several thousand people that are forced to resign. They're basically told, you resign or we fire you. And then a couple hundred that were just plain out fired. They weren't given a chance to resign or else they chose not to resign by 1951. And then we get the McCarran Internal Security Act. Now this is very controversial. That's McCarran. McCarran. The McCarran Internal Security Act. And in 1950, Congress passed this over Truman's veto, by the way. So Congress passes this, and Truman vetoes it, and Congress, supermajority, passes it over his veto. And among other things, it required communist agencies in America to register with the federal government. Now, the reason Truman vetoed it, among other things, was the First Amendment. So, can you force people that are gathering together to register with the government? I mean, think about this. Like, does the Humane Society have to register with the federal government? Does First Baptist Church of wherever have to register with the federal government? So, however, Congress felt like, and I realize there's a difference between communist groups that are trying to subvert the government. However, in modern times, people are arguing that Christians are causing political problems and they're not voting the way and they're not supporting the policies that the public wants. So, I mean, would it be right to say that communists have to register? Because keep in mind that later down the road that may mean Christians have to register. Or name the religion, name the political group, or economic group, they may have to register. So anyway, Truman vetoes this, and Congress thinks it's so important they pass it over top of his veto. Okay, now let's look at the Rosenberg case. This is going to be a little bit complicated as far as there are several names involved, so try to stick with me. I'll try to keep it as light as possible, but this is very important because this adds to the anti-communist hysteria in America because we find an example of people that are involved in a communist plot. So, 1950, a British scientist by the name of Klaus Fuchs, he says, hey, I gave American atomic secrets to the Russians. Well, how did you get them? Well, I'm glad you asked. So he gave Russian secrets because he got them from two people's brother-in-law. These two people, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. they're supposed to be the masterminds in this plot here. So Ethel's sister David, he's not David Rosenberg, he's David Greenglass. So David Greenglass worked on the Manhattan Project. And the Rosenbergs, who are supposed to have communist leanings, they're the masterminds behind this plot, according to David Greenglass, Ethel's brother. So keep in mind, Ethel's brother sells her out. All right. So David Greenglass is convinced to participate in this because Julius and Ethel Rosenberg have orchestrated this and masterminded this plot to get the atomic secrets to the Russians so that the communists, with whom they sympathize, will have the atomic bomb sooner, which will give them an advantage in the Cold War. So, anyway, Klaus Fuchs gets these documents directly from Greenglass, and Greenglass gave other agents, communist agents, sensitive information as well. But it's supposed to have all been masterminded, orchestrated, plotted through the efforts of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, this all comes out of the trial, they're found guilty. And on April 5th, 1951, they are found guilty and sentenced to death. Now they appeal for 2 years, but their appeals are constantly shot down. They can't go any higher in their appeals. And 2 years later, roughly, they both die in summer of 1953 by electric chair. So June 19th, 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are electrocuted to death for their crimes. However, it's not the fact that they were sentenced to death, it's the fact that they were actually involved in a communist plot in America to help the communists against America. And this fuels the hysteria that's already going on. So there's more anti-communist panic going on in America because there actually is a communist plot. So it's back to that you're not paranoid if they're really out to get you. Okay, now on to McCarthyism. This is where things start to heat up a little bit. Joseph McCarthy, so for McCarthyism, you need to know it was Joseph McCarthy that was the leader of this. He's a relatively unknown, undistinguished first-term Republican senator. He's from Wisconsin, but here's where he distinguishes himself. February of 1950, he's in Wheeling, West Virginia. So shout out to Carter. He's in Wheeling, West Virginia, giving a speech, and in his speech, he says, "I hold in my hand a list of 205 known communists currently working in the American State Department." Those are never the words you want to hear, right? You never want to hear there are 205 known communists working in the State Department. So it gets sensationalized. Everyone's freaking out because there are so many communists working in the State Department. Well, the question is, were there really? Because McCarthy continues to level accusations against all kinds of people, and it almost seems like a control game because he's saying, look what these Democrats did. Here I am, Republican. I had access to this information. Of course they did, so what's their problem? And he really, he's the chairman of a special subcommittee that's going to investigate. He's made chairman of a special subcommittee that's going to investigate these charges of communism. And one government official after another is constantly being hauled into McCarthy, and he's forcing them to play ball with him. Figuratively, of course. And he never really produces any evidence. So the question is, were there really any American State Department officials or American officials, period, that were involved with communism? Possibly, maybe even probably. Did McCarthy have proof? He never came right out with it. So McCarthy, it starts intimidating all kinds of people. Even Dwight Eisenhower didn't say, and Dwight Eisenhower spoke his mind a lot, and everyone loved him. Even Dwight Eisenhower was quiet on the issue of McCarthy. So anyway, we're gonna bring this to a close here, but McCarthy, he is going to play a little bit of a role in the next chapter. I'm going to bring him in anyway. I think he stops in this chapter. But we're going to see Dwight Eisenhower and his role in leading the country in a little bit.